Right, good morning everybody. This is Prof. Stradom speaking, and we're on the Swartkops Estuary. In the absence of a prac, where we actually take you out into the field and we do some collecting of fishes relative to the salinity environment in the Swartkops. What I thought I would do is basically just put a video together of some of the classic species that one gets in the estuary, and then talk a little bit about the basic ecology, and then we'll include some videos of past pracs, and in that introduce you to the field work and give you some data to work up. Okay, so the important thing to remember about South African estuaries is they're subject to tidal inundation twice per day. So we have 2 high tides and 2 low tides every day. At the moment, the tide is still on its way out, so this is basically what the Swartkops here in Tippers Creek looks like on a spring low tide. This afternoon when the tide comes in, it's going to be distinctly different. So we basically are classified as having a microtidal range, so it's a relatively small tidal range. So from the mean seawater level, our high tides on a spring will increase to about 1.7 meters, and then on the spring low tide, it'll drop to around 40 centimeters below mean spring at its maximum. I'm just going to interrupt as we go and just point out some creatures. So we've just had a pied kingfisher dive behind us here. He's unfortunately flown off now, but obviously as the tide level drops, we have fishes, small juveniles that are easier to catch, so the kingfishers will be very active in fishing now when it's easier for them to get hold of prey. So estuaries are actually classified globally based on 4 main criteria, and these are geomorphology, distribution of salinity and density of the water, circulation patterns, and system energetics. So how the system is basically powered by wind, by tides, by river flow, and so forth. In South Africa, we divide the estuary up into salinity zones based on a system called the Venice system. And this is actually very important for classification of animal distribution along the length of the estuary. And the most saline zone near the mouth we refer to as the euhaline zone. So that typically ranges from a salinity of 30 and above. Then we have, as we move up from the mouth towards the head of the estuary, we have the polyhaline zone, which ranges from 18 to 30. And then we have the very important mesohaline zone, which ranges in salinity from 5 to 18. And that's the typical true estuarine zone. That's where we have the highest nutrients, the peak of nutrients from river and sea input. We have the peak in productivity, primary productivity and secondary productivity. The zone after that we refer to as the oligohaline zone, which is 0.5 to 5 salinity units. And then obviously right at the head of the estuary we have the limnetic zone, which is less than 0.5. And this is truly the absolute upper estuary at the ebb and flow part of the estuary where it meets the river. So the definition of an estuary that we use in South Africa was first proposed by Day in 1980, and he describes an estuary as a partially enclosed coastal body of water which is either permanently or periodically open to the sea, wherein there is an immeasurable variation in salinity due to the mixture of seawater with fresh water derived from land drainage. And this definition deviates from the classic definitions used in the middle of the 1900s that were proposed basically based on European estuaries, and they don't have estuaries that close seasonally like we do here in the southern hemisphere, especially in South Africa. So there was a necessity to actually revise the definition to cater for our systems. And then in 1989 Haydorn actually added to the definition of an estuary, and he referred to it as that portion of the river system entering the sea where there is, within the boundaries of land, a gradual transition in the physical, chemical and biological characteristics from fresh water to seawater. And this definition is a nice one because it allows us to actually fully understand the transition along the course of an estuary in the salt content of the water, in the salinity regime, and the arrangement of animals along this continuum. So in South Africa we define estuaries according to type, and if you look in the literature you'll see that historically we identified 5 types, but these have subsequently been expanded upon, and we now have 7 official types of estuaries in South Africa. We have approximately 300 estuaries in the country. Many of them are actually here in the Eastern Cape province, the bulk of the estuaries of South Africa. And in South Africa we base these types on 4 criteria, namely mouth state. So we're standing at the Swartkops now in Tippers Creek, but this mouth is actually permanently open, and it doesn't close at all to the sea. And so that's where you see that ship down there at the bridge. That's the mouth of the Swartkops. That's one of the estuarine types we get in South Africa. We also have an estuary type called an estuarine bay, and this is a large estuarine system that has a large mouth, and it's predominantly marine influenced, and a good example of that is the Knysna estuary. It's an estuarine bay. We also have temporary open closed estuaries, or some people call them intermittently open or intermittently closed estuaries, and these ones will open seasonally with rainfall. They are actually the most abundant estuary types we get in South Africa. We also have river mouths. So these are estuaries that have very low salinity in the mouth region, or throughout the small estuarine portion, and they're overwhelmingly dominated by river water influence, and the Orange River mouth is a classic example. Then we also have estuarine lakes, and these are very similar to intermittently open closed estuaries or temporary open closed estuaries. You'll see those words used interchangeably in the literature. But estuarine lakes are very similar, so they obviously are different in their sheer volume, so lake sizes are considerably larger, and the Swartflay lake system is a classic example of that. And then the 2 new types of estuaries that have been identified in the last few years are micro estuaries, and these are small little estuarine systems that occur along our coast. They're really tiny, and hence the name micro estuaries, but they're still classified as estuaries because they have a salinity gradient, and they have typically estuarine plant and animal species occupying the habitats. We also have a more recently identified estuary type, which is particularly prevalent on the west coast, and these are called ephemeral estuaries. So they will dry up completely in the summer period when there's low rainfall, and then in the winter months when we have rain, you'll have an estuarine system reforming, and you'll have species actually occupying that niche space, and most of these are actually estuarine species. So for your practical, it's important to understand the distribution of animals according to their tolerance within an estuarine system. So the species that would typically occupy an estuary, if we start from the mouth regions, we would have stenohaline marine species. And these are species that will move in from the ocean and occupy only the lower reaches, and wouldn't go further up the system as a result of their inability to tolerate the salinity change. The species that occur throughout the true estuarine portion we refer to as euryhaline marine species, and these species regularly go into lower salinity water. They're marine species, but they will actually make their way up and feed well up into the estuary up until a salinity of about 18. Then we have many truly estuarine species, and these species range the total extent of the true estuarine zone within the estuary, and that salinity is between 5 and 18 salinity units. And then if we go right up to the top of the estuary, we'll start finding oligohaline species, and these are species that live under a very low salinity condition, so less than a salinity level of 5. So the fishes that one finds in our temperate systems will fall into these categories, and it's part of our practical to go and explore different salinity environments and the different fish species that are occupying those environments, and to actually plot species diversity relative to the salinity environment of the estuary. Okay, so estuaries have numerous threats. And as you can imagine, most of them are anthropogenic, so human-induced threats. And if we just look down the bottom of Tippers Creek towards the mouth, we can see some of those threats. Anything that's protruding into the water is changing the hydrodynamics of the current flow. And particularly associated with estuary mouths, we have a lot of bridges that cross those mouths. And when you have bridge pylons extending into the water, they are actually changing current flow. Often what happens is, as the incoming tide brings in a sediment layer, when they hit those pylons, they tend to slow down, and the sediment load that's being carried in is actually dropped. And so you have extensive sandbank formation on the inward side of the pylons. And then, as you can see further down here, we also have jetties that protrude into the water. So these are also all obstructions to current flow, and in actual fact we have legislation now where you are not allowed to build a jetty anymore. It has to have strict approval because of the changes to current flow. Okay, so here we have one of our first species we're going to encounter today, the common octopus, Octopus vulgaris. He's on the hunt, coming out of his den. There tends to be a lot of octopus in the lower reaches of the Swartkorps of late. We're obviously in a serious drought, and so this part of Tippers Creek in front of my house here is tending to be a lot more saline. It's basically seawater, so a lot of the marine species actually make their way up and are residing up in this part of the estuary. So we're typically under marine conditions with a salinity of around 35. Okay, so here we have the den of that Octopus vulgaris that we just saw. So obviously, as the tide has receded, he's come out of here and gone out hunting in the shallows. But when the tide comes in, he'll climb back in there and will do some ambush predation of passing fish. And over here we actually have the shell of a common estuarine species. This is Solon capensis. So this is one of our bivalves. It's very common here. This one was obviously used as bait, but the snail basically lives inside the two halves, and the shell is actually through muscle contractions embedded or pulled into the mud, and the animal lives basically vertically in the mud like this, forming a typical keyhole shaped hole at the surface. And these are very, very common deposit feeders in the Swartkorps estuary. Okay, so I want to point out some of the species that are actually living on the seagrass. Here we have these very common little snails. This is an Asterius species. So these are important scavengers. It's a small little gastropod, and they are readily living on top of. They actually migrate up the shafts of the zostra leaves, and they're feeding on all this decaying matter. And then when the tide comes in, they will all migrate back down to the sediment surface. So you can see this snail. They're called tick shells. Asterius krausi is the genus and species. So this is a very common species here in our estuaries. Okay, so this algae you see over here is actually a submerged estuarine macrophyte. This is the common Zostera capensis. Many people refer to this species as one of the seagrasses, and they're quite prolific in many of our temperate estuaries, and they are an important habitat for many species. You can see on the top layer of the Zostera, you'll see if I give a little shake, all this detritus that's actually been trapped. This is an important food source for many deposit feeders. It's basically bacterially broken down plant and animal matter, and this is a very rich food source. So obviously at low tide the eel or seagrass lies flat, but when the tide comes in again and it's submerged, it all stands up vertically, and it's a very important refuge area for all sorts of fauna. Okay, so here we have a common estuarine species. This is that was Clinus superciliosus, the common clipfish, and yeah, anyway, they are very important predators in the estuary. And they're very, very common in the eelgrass bed here in front of us. Okay, so here we actually have a sponge, a marine sponge. So they'll typically grow in the lower reaches of the Swartkops estuary. So this is a single species and a single individual. So essentially what they do is they'll be filtering through the water. So they'll have microscopic little inlet pores on the actual animal, and then they'll siphon water in and then out through these shared little chimney holes, filter feeding whatever microscopic food particles they can actually catch within the water column. So here we actually have some oysters. These are not native oysters. These are the giant Pacific oyster, and they are part of a aquaculture venture out in the bay. But obviously the adults are reproductively active, and they spawn, and those little larvae make their way into nearby rocky shores and obviously the Swartkops estuary, and they have basically taken over in the lower reaches of the estuary. So you can see a really large Pacific oyster, and numerous creatures actually living associated with these oysters. So they're basically forming structural habitat here. The disadvantage of having these aliens in the Swartkops is they actually outcompete the native oyster species. You can see here's a little sea urchin, a black mussel, and one of the chitin species that are all attached to the substrate in this area. Octopuses are very curious species, so you know, he's obviously seen the white of my gumboot and come out of his den to explore. In actual fact, octopus are the only invertebrate species that have the same ethical treatment protocols as vertebrates. Oops. I think it was just red bait. So this is a lesser known mussel species in the Swartkops. It's actually an estuarine mussel, and the only reason we're seeing them now is because we've got quite a few octopus living in the area that never before used to occur so high up. If you can pan that way, there's an octopus sitting there at a den, and so these octopus are actually are digging these mussels out of the mud in amongst the seagrass, and so we don't normally see these mussels. So it's actually very nice to actually be able to see some of the more cryptic species. So octopuses are actually very territorial, and they will fight each other to the death for space. And as you can see, this rather aggressive octopus moved up to the den of another, and the other one just got the heck out of here. Oh, it's run into that one, check. Oh. Our shadows. So these are important scavengers in the estuary. This is one of the Palemon shrimps, and they are very, very common. I can hear a snapping shrimp snapping from somewhere here in the seagrass. Finding them is very difficult, but if you hear that clicking sound, that's another species of shrimp. Lots of different species of shrimp in the estuary. Okay, so over here we have the keyhole shaped burrow of the common pencil bait, the Solen capensis, and you can see all around here there's lots of holes. They're quite common, so they're down in their burrows now. And the way you tell the difference between a pencil bait hole and a mud prawn hole is the mud prawn hole tends to be round, whereas this one is the shape of a keyhole. So animals in estuaries arrange themselves horizontally along the length of the estuary based on their salinity tolerance. And with the difficulties of being able to identify some of the benthic organisms easily on a university practical, what we would have done in our prac is actually collected fishes, because they do a similar thing. They're organizing themselves according to their salinity tolerance. So we'd be able to tell a little bit about the physicochemical conditions of the estuary based on the species that we would typically find in any given area. And so what I've done is I've collected some of the common species just with a little scoop net here in Tippers Creek, just to show you what they look like, so that you can familiarize yourself with these species. So the important thing to remember is fishes occur in estuaries and they belong to different groups. So many of these fishes are using estuaries as nursery areas. Some of them just come in to feed from the ocean and go back out into the ocean again. Some of them are here accidentally, and some of them spend their entire life cycle within the estuary. So we're going to run through a couple of the species and just tell you a little bit more about them. So the group that's resident within estuaries, I'm going to show you an example of that first. So here we have a shaggy sea hare. So it's a slug, similar to the nudibranchs, and this sea hare, they're very common here in the Swartkops. They are prolific grazers, herbivores here in the estuary. So Bursatella leachi, the shaggy sea hare, is a very common grazer here in the lower reaches of the Swartkops. When you harass them too much, they release a pink ink as a predator avoidance mechanism. But these guys are very common here in the lower reaches, in amongst the seagrass beds. Okay, so the lower Swartkops is particularly saline. It's basically seawater for the first few kilometers before you start seeing a measurable dilution of seawater into the typical brackish water that characterizes estuaries. So in the lower reaches here where I am now, we actually have the Cape urchin, which are fairly common. So they are Parenchinus angulosus, and they are prolific here in the lower reaches under rocks. So Archaeotula capensis, the estuarine mussel, occurs throughout the subtropical and warm temperate coast of South Africa. They're a fairly cryptic species. You don't get to see them very often because they're embedded in the mud. But the very active octopus population in Tippers Creek at the moment is digging these guys up and bringing them up to the surface, and obviously consuming them along with the other black mussel and alien Mediterranean mussel. So we also have a host of polychaete worms that occupy the sediment layers of estuaries. There are many different species, and they're actually quite tricky to identify. And here on my hand, who's trying to escape, is a small little amphipod. We also have numerous species of amphipod that occur in estuaries. We're actually collecting a few of these to feed the university seahorses this morning. So he'll go in as food. So here we have a very important species in estuaries. This is the mud prawn. This is a very small specimen, so very tiny still. These guys get quite big, around about that size at their full size. So this is Upper africana, and they characteristically have U-shaped burrows, and they filter water with their little swimmerettes. They filter water through the U-shaped burrow, and they will feed on all the microscopic bits and detritus and that are being drawn through their U-shaped burrow. Okay, so one of the common macrofaunal species in estuaries is the marsh crab. This guy's not very happy to be held. So this is Sesama catenata, and they burrow in the mud and the sand of estuaries, and they basically pick microscopic little organisms out of mud that they're constantly picking up with their pincers and feeding on. This particular one is a male. If I turn it over, you can see the triangular shape of the underside of the carapace there. The females have a more semicircular flap. So the common marsh crab is one of the important species in the Swartkops. So this is another common resident species, Clinus superciliosus, or the superclipphus. So they readily live here in the seagrass beds, and they're quite predatory there, ambush predators. They're very camouflaged in the seagrass. They are also found in the ocean, in rocky shore pools and those sorts of things, but gullies. But they're very common in estuaries, and they actually give birth to live young. And so their late stage larvae that hatch from or are born basically start their life out in the estuary. Okay, so this is a very common estuarine species, and we would have caught quite a few of these. This is the Cape silverside. Now they can spawn both in estuaries and in the ocean. So if they were deprived of an estuarine environment, they would still be able to spawn in the ocean, but they readily spawn in estuaries, and they're extremely common. This is still quite a young fish, so they would get to about that size as adults. And Atherina breviceps is a prolific planktivore within estuaries, and they specifically occur more in the lower reaches, and in the middle and upper reaches they replaced by a sister species in another family, Gilchristella estuaria, which is the estuary round herring. So we can see that this one is Atherina breviceps because the gut over here is squared off. It doesn't slope off towards the anal fin, and it's not so easy to see, but they actually have two dorsal fins as opposed to one that Gilchristella estuaria has. Here we have another common estuary resident species. They can also spawn in the ocean, but they're mostly resident in the seagrass beds. This is the long snout pipefish, Synathus temenkia. So we would have caught some of these on our practical. They've very interesting little fish, and they're in the same family as the seahorses, Hippocampus capensis. You can see they have a very long protrusible snout that's very characteristic of this family, so they're searching for zooplankton within the seagrass bed, so they can put their snout into all the little nooks and crannies and pick out zooplankton. So the Cape Mooney is another very interesting species. I don't want to hold him out the water too long, but these species actually are spawned in the ocean, and they migrate into estuaries and up into the rivers to use them as a nursery area, and they are very, very common. I'm just going to let this one go and I'll tell you a little bit more about it. So the Cape Mooney Monodactylus falciformis undergoes great migrations up into the rivers, where they feed extensively on insect larvae and other small invertebrates. Their life history strategy is actually to move into fresh water. So they have an amazing ability to osmoregulate and go from completely seawater over the course of a few days into completely fresh water. Okay, so this is a very common shrimp in estuaries, Palemon parengui. Sand shrimp, they're very important scavengers in the ecosystem, and they are here by the millions in the seagrass beds. So we would have caught definitely some of these in our prac while we were netting. So estuaries are also home to many goby species in the family Gobiidae, and this is a very common one. Samagobius narsniensis, it's the Narsna sand goby, and they are sand specialists along with the flatfish, the soles, and they're actually also invertebrate feeders, ambush predators of all sorts of zooplankton, and they are very common in our estuaries in South Africa. So here we have another common estuarine species. They spawn in the ocean, but the larvae make their way into estuaries and they grow out. This one is about 3 months old. It's still very much a juvenile, and this is Heteromicturus capensis, so it's one of the 2 very common flatfish species that actually use our estuaries as nursery areas, and they are prolific benthic feeders on benthic invertebrates in estuaries. This is one of the very common marine species that occur in estuaries. This is the Cape Stumpnose, Rhabdopsagus holubi. So when they're small like this, they're still feeding extensively on invertebrates, but as they grow, they will switch to a more herbivorous diet and also feed on epiphytic fauna on seagrass fronds. So they're very common, important species, important prey species for other larger fish and for birds. Just lifting up some of the rocks here. This is actually a colonial ascidian growing on the underside of this rock. As I said earlier, there's 2 different forms. There's the colonial ascidians and the solitary ascidians. Okay, I've managed to net a little shoal of small mullet. These are very much juveniles, and they're probably only about 3 months old. This is Smugelcephalus, and mullet are a very important family in estuaries, and they are actually important bait fish for birds and for larger juveniles. So we would have caught probably at least 3 or 4 species of mullet in our pracs, and this would be one of them. So this is the flathead mullet, and they're really tiny. Okay, so here we have a very common species that occurs in the Swartkops. This is a marine solitary ascidian, Pieura stolonifera, and we're often caught as red bait. You can see on this solitary ascidian there's 2 openings over here. So basically what this animal does is it circulates water through its body, so it siphons water in here and will release it out there and extract small food particles. So Ascidians are very common marine species. You get solitary ones like this, and you also get colonial ones which are more typical of the marine environment. Okay, just scrounging in amongst the rocks, there's another marine species, one of the small nudibranchs. So they're basically little sea slugs that they crawl around on reefs and rocky substrate here in the estuary as well. So many of them are actually toxic or provide quite a nasty sting, so I won't touch that one. And behind me we have another rare species in the Swarcops. It's my Bengal Gaia. She's particularly unhappy that she's not getting enough attention, walking carefully while we're doing this lesson. Gaia, Gaia. So one of the unfortunate things about an urban estuary is plastic pollution, and we actually have an extensive amount of plastic pollution in the Swarcops. There's ongoing efforts by the Swarcops Conservancy to actually collect all the plastic, and they do that weekly, creating jobs for unemployed people, assisting with litter picking. And this actually is the container that mud prawns were provided in. So there is a legal fishery for mud prawns as bait, so people are given special permits to collect, and then they may resell from a designated point. But unfortunately this hasn't worked very well because a lot of people participate in bait digging illegally, and then they sell the prawns from all over the place to anglers, and they come in these plastic containers. So this is obviously leftover from fishing activity, and yeah, I always try and do my bit to find plastic and just put it into the recycling.